able to go to the recording of class. Okay? Any questions on that? I will ask that frequently because everybody's these little tiny boxes, and I can't always read, body language and expressions and things to tell whether or not it's like, the hell is he talking about? What class am I in? Have you ever done that? Come on, be honest. Have any of you ever suddenly realized, oh my God, I'm in the wrong class? Yeah. I mean, I've never walked into the wrong class to teach, but well into my career, I would have dreams before fall term where I would do that. Either that classic one where it's like, where the hell is my classroom? They moved my classroom and they didn't tell me. Now that's just after doing this for years, right? So, I think it's probably easier than most people think to end up in the wrong classroom. On Zoom, it's a little bit tougher. It's one of the few advantages of Zoom. If you don't have access to the Moodle site, you don't have access to the link, you can't stumble into the wrong class. It's hard to have half of the class without video. I know, normally I say that, if you're going to be here, you got to activate your camera. It is a little bit off-putting to people who look and see blank screens, especially when someone's talking. I'm going to leave it to your discretion only because I don't think we're going to be doing this all term. But if it turns out that we're going to be doing this over a prolonged period of time, I'm going to ask that you, get your environment together and have an active camera. Okay. It is sort of like you're ignoring us if your camera's on. That it feels that way, whether you intend it or not. And let's face it, no one cares what you really intend anymore on anything. It's only what we perceive, right? And if we decide we don't like you, we'll figure out a reason why. All right. So anyway, that's on the recording. Yeah. He said he doesn't like us. No, I said we don't like you. Okay, I'm talking for all of us. All right. One of the things I want to bring your attention to then is there's a PDF right under the Zoom link for today's class that says notes for module 1. All right. Every module has written notes, every single one. What these are is, just so it makes sense to you, I rewrote this class pretty significantly over the summer. When I write a class, or for that matter, rewrite it, I actually write out a relatively coherent manuscript. It's just my way of thinking out loud, so that by the time I've written a class for the first time, I've probably got 100 pages. Okay, then what I do is go back and summarize that as notes. That's what you're getting here. Now, some of this you'll notice will be longer. Some of it is, instead of being like a page of sort of telegraphic looking notes, there might be 3, 4, 5 pages of, more or less coherent prose. Okay, and it's because those are areas where I'm anticipating you might have less background, or you might require more information, or I'm not requiring that you go out and spend money on a text. You don't have to own Aristotle's Politics, or you don't have to own, Hobbes's Leviathan and actually read all whatever 500 pages of it. Okay, so it might take me 2 pages to distill it or something like that. But in case you're still not sure, there's no additional text other than what's provided for you on the Moodle page. So you're not out any additional money or any hassle, okay? I've been doing that for a long time, and it seems to work. There seems to be enough information for an introductory class that you don't really need, a text. And it really isn't a textbook that exists that I've ever been able to find that would fit this class, okay? So that's what's going on there. I highly recommend that you look at those notes. And if only because, that's sort of what I follow to the extent that I follow anything when we're discussing in class, okay? Right, so there are 2 things I want you to think about for the first module. And one of them is why we even bother with politics, why we even bother to think about it, why we even bother to study it, why there is a program that's, dedicated exclusively to the study of politics, that when we had sufficient staffing used to be a standalone department. At most real universities, it still is. And yet, let's be honest. The vast majority of adult Americans know next to nothing about politics. They have no sense of political history. We know this from just volumes of available data. They don't know who their legislators are. They don't understand the content of policies. Again and again and again, the overwhelming majority of adult Americans score very, very low on any kind of measure of political knowledge, either about the United States or about their own state or about their local government, and much less about the world. So you might think, well, then why are we studying this stuff? Clearly, adult America doesn't care about it. Okay. We also know that, as I indicate in the notes, we've got this extraordinary political history that demonstrates, at least as much as it demonstrates anything else, that politics has been an arena of astonishing corruption. Okay. That America has always been famous for the expanse, the depth, the naked audacity of its political corruption. Now, when I say corruption, I would make a note of this, by the way. When I use the term corruption politically, what I mean is using public institutions and public processes for exclusively personal gain, irrespective of the public cost. That's corruption. So that, for example, you're running for office, and instead of listening to your constituents, the people who voted for you, and let's face it, the people who may not have voted for you, but are still the constituents of your state or your district or whatever, you simply listen to the loudest voice of private interest and you legislate on behalf of that. That is, by definition, corruption. It's affecting public outcomes to the exclusive end of advancing private gain. That's corruption, okay? There is legal corruption in that sense. It's legal for legislators to ignore you. People, not recently, but historically, people in the United States have tried to sue elected officials for not keeping their campaign promises. They have evidence. Here's the evidence. Here it is in something you wrote, or there's this news press conference or whatever, where you said, if elected, you were going to do this, and you haven't done, and you've not even tried, okay? And that's gone to court, and it's always failed. Politicians are under no legal obligations to do what they tell you they're going to do. They can do pretty much anything they want while they are in power, as long as they don't break the law, okay? And let's face it, as long as they don't get caught, they can break the law, okay? And so you might think, well, why don't we study something meaningful and important? Why do we study corruption? And why do we study, this stuff that we're not involved in? We don't have, much involvement in politics. Politics is overwhelmingly a spectator sport in the United States, okay? We're not a democracy, and we were never intended to be. None of the framers, right, came down in favor of making the United States a fully functioning democracy. None of them, okay? The Constitution does not outline a democratic form of government. It doesn't. What kind of government do we have?
I mean, it's listed as a representative, a republic.
That's right. That's what a republic is, a representative government.
But it's more of kind of like an oligarchy, I guess.
Well,
like a corporate kind of state, or I don't know.
I mean, if you look, I'm just thinking, what was it designed to be? Let's refine the question. It was designed to be a republic. It was also designed to be a commercial republic. That is, the primary intent of the framers was that political life in the United States be stabilized to the extent that it did not interfere with active commerce, okay? It wasn't to empower people. It wasn't to emancipate the enslaved, okay? None of those things was intended by any of the framers, none of them, okay? It's just simply not historically accurate, okay? I don't mean that none of them had that as an ultimate aspiration. But when they sat down in Philadelphia and boarded up the windows and wouldn't let anybody take notes outside and everything else, essentially, you can argue they carried out a coup, because the existing Articles of Confederation did not empower them to do what they did in Philadelphia. Okay, the first act of that group of people was to throw out the Articles of Confederation. Okay, it's important that we remember that, though. So when you're fed that line of bilge about how these heroic individuals wanted to declare this empowered republic of participating people, there's no truth to that. There's no truth to that at all. Okay, and so I don't want, I mean, you can take Sean Patterson's Political Science 202, which focuses more specifically on the United States. This is not really a class in American politics, but I think we should start where we're most familiar, okay? Because this is an American university, And we are, for the most part, Americans studying things that should be of value to Americans. We don't really think of ourselves, most of us, as citizens of the world. We think of ourselves as Americans. Okay. And so, what I'm suggesting is there are some reasons for us to think about and be more knowledgeable about politics. No, there aren't very many opportunities for us to participate, but there are opportunities for us to make those intermittent opportunities more meaningful because we're more informed. Okay. The assumption of a republic, which Jackson rightly defined as a republic, a representative form of government, is that the people will not govern directly, because the assumption is we have jobs to do and crops to raise and homes to build and families to feed and take care of and lives to live and everything else. And so we choose from among us people we trust to go and take with them some aggregate notion of what our demands are, or what our needs are, or what our concerns are. Okay, we can't tell the government directly what to do. We don't have that power. We can't tell the government directly to stop something. We don't have that power. They outgun us. And for all of you who are, for example, let's say, Second Amendment activists, there is not, despite the fact that we have over 300 million privately owned weapons, most of them owned by about 9% of the population, we do not have enough firepower to keep the state from doing what it wants to do. And we never will have, under the existing, the existing dispensation. In fact, one of the definitions of the modern definitions of the state is a monopoly of coercive violence. That defines the government or the state, okay? But it doesn't mean that we're prisoners of that government, all right? We can, if we concede that, we can say, well, I can't do anything. And then you default, make yourself a prisoner of that government. But we're not, because we do have elections. And in elections, we can decide whether or not we want to pay attention, whether or not we really want to figure out what's going on, or just vote the way someone tells us to vote. Many Americans just vote the way someone tells them to vote. Usually it's someone in either the Republican or the Democratic Party. Often people are voting, when they vote for someone, they're actually voting against someone else. Elections are imperfect, but they exist. And as an institution, they were created to allow us some oversight of government, some chance to exercise or withhold consent, okay? Much later in the term, we'll get to this small L liberal notion of what's called government by consent, okay? The Republic was, to some extent, framed under that assumption of government by consent of the governed. What would limit government? The consent of the governed. How do we exercise our ability to consent or withhold that consent? One of the ways we do that is we hold regular, free and fair elections, okay? Historically, they weren't terribly free or fair. They have become both more free and more fair over the last 240 odd years, okay? They're imperfect, but they're there. But that's not the only way that we can participate. I mean, we can participate because, unlike a lot of other republics, we have a pretty specified right to speak freely, okay? It's expected. Americans expect that they have the right, whether they know anything or not, that Americans have a constitutionally protected right to be political blowhards, to say anything they want about anyone they want, to hate the Republicans or hate the Democrats or hate Joe Biden or hate Donald Trump, and do it out loud in public, right? And have no consequences for that. And to some extent, they're right. I mean, there is an extraordinary constitutional guarantee of free expression. That's a built-in mechanism, the intent of which is to allow people in an ongoing way to either express or withhold consent. So that when the government does something, there's some mechanism of, for want of a better term, feedback. You do something and then you look at the response of the public. Well, do they seem to be going along with it? No. Okay, well, you know what, we better rethink that. Is this something we know we need to do? Well, then we're going to have to weather a storm, because there's a growing public tide against this. And we're going to have to do either a better job of explaining what we're doing, or we're going to have to figure we're going to lose some support, okay? That's the way the system is built. There's nothing wrong or aberrant about that. the idea of having large groups of disaffected people. That's natural if you have an empowered system. If you have a system that is a vibrant representative system, a republic, in which people are expected to participate, okay? If you don't hear that, if you don't hear people disagreeing, if you don't hear people arguing, something's probably wrong, okay? Either it means a lot of people don't know what's going on, or a lot of people have withdrawn, and that's dangerous. You cannot maintain a vibrant, stable republic if people withdraw. You can't do that, okay? So one of the reasons we study politics is because we want to understand how this system was set up so we can understand why it works the way it does and get a sense of when it is or is not working. You can't do that with so-called common sense, okay? There are two reasons why common sense doesn't help us in politics, okay? One is because politics just isn't that simple. Two, sense isn't that common, okay? It's really hard to be sensible about something when you don't know anything about it. And we've got this kind of folksy notion that, you know, anybody anywhere has the right to an opinion and that opinion should matter. Somebody tell me why. Why should everyone's opinion matter when many of the people expressing opinions know nothing? Why should we, for example, take the advice about an important public decision when the people expressing that advice don't know what they're talking about? Why should we do that? That's not a rhetorical question. I'm actually asking you.
It's more of like a matter of principle, right? It's like, so long as we allow people to keep talking, we can preserve the principle of the freedom to be able to speak. And
okay, we're not talking about allowing them to speak though, Jackson. We're talking about being compelled to follow what they say.
So what,
see
what
the
is
difference?
your question?
We shouldn't.
Well, this is a fundamental political question. At what point should the system respond? Okay, now some people say, well, it should respond if in an election, a majority of people say they want something, they should get it. But what if a majority of that majority doesn't know what it's talking about? What do we do then?
I think we have to stay the course, however unpopular it is. We're there right now. There are a majority of people who feel very specifically about something that the rest of the community feels is bringing us to a detrimental crisis. And I think we either have to keep educating the public, keep trying to figure out why they are uneducated or they object to whatever the issue is, so that we can either reposition or, like you said earlier, just sort of go on and just think there will be blowback. There will be people who don't see it as popular. There will be people who dissent just maybe for the right to dissent.
Okay, but you know, as Jackson suggested, they do have that right. And you're right. I mean, it is a commitment to principle to allow the expression of even unpopular views. Jackson, I think that's what you meant. Is that right? I don't want to.
No, that's definitely what I was trying to say. Yeah.
And it's absolutely accurate. And so this is where the political dilemma arises, though. Yes, we've allowed you to speak, but what's the use of your being able to speak if you know we're not listening? That is, if we're under no obligation to act on what you say, even if there's a critical mass of you. For example, a majority of Americans during the early civil rights movement of, let's say, the 1960s and the early 1970s, a majority of Americans opposed the use of school busing, in order to move children around in districts to achieve integration. A majority of Americans opposed that. And yet my generation was bused. I was in that generation they took us out of one really crummy neighborhood and they put us in another crummy neighborhood. And the problem with being in a crummy neighborhood is that if you don't have any friends in that crummy neighborhood, you're going to get the living crap beaten out of you. And it's going to happen repeatedly, either until you beat the living crap out of someone or until you find some other way to make them happy, you know? And that's the calculus of the street, okay? And the whole you know, movement toward integration and the whole kumbaya about using busing and can't we all just get along, threw kids into this crucible, children into this violent crucible as an experiment, okay? And yet, even having lived through it and having my parents, both of whom were fairly, you know, enlightened people, you know, didn't have a lot of education. My dad had some, but my mom had a high school degree. But they were horrified by it because they saw us coming home most days, coming home after a fight of some kind. Because, you know, kids will fight for any reason. Americans will fight for any reason. We just fight. That's my parking place. Well, wait a minute. No, it's not, man. Well, it is now. And my neck's bigger than yours and I'm going to hurt you. Oh, I guess I better move my car. You know what? Before you do, let me kick your ass. You know, I mean, come on. It's almost patriotic to fight if you're an American. It seems at times. Okay. And so that was a policy that in many ways was unpopular. And yet we can look at that. And the reason why I bring that up is that it came up during the last campaign when the current vice president called out now the president, then a candidate, by saying, wait a minute, you opposed this. And yet it was this busing that allowed me to have better opportunities, me and people like me. So that issue is not dead. That notion of, well, what's the role of the government in, for want of a better term, social engineering, okay? Should the government be actively involved in improving society? That's a public outcome, okay? And that's why we study politics, because now we're going to define it. Think of politics as the process through which we achieve public outcomes, not private outcomes, but public outcomes. That's the simplest way. Now, there's a video, it's kind of silly, but sometimes I seem like I'm having fun at your expense. I'm not. I like that video. It was funny when I did it, and I'm standing by it. But one of the things I do in there is I offer up a traditional definition within the social sciences and political science of politics. And it's the process of determining who gets what, when, and how. Now, some of you may already have watched that video. You might want to take a look at it before the first assignment. Just because, I mean, what I've done is dropped in some definitions there, and it's sort of animated and stuff. So there's stuff, I'm trying to get stuff in there that might stick in your head and help you remember, okay? But this notion of a process, first of all, politics is not the campaign. Now, if the only political news information you get is from the so-called news, most of which is commentary, you would begin to think that all politics was arguing between Republicans and Democrats, but it's not. Most of what politics really is what happens out of the side of the cameras and away from the reporters. It's people sitting down and hammering out deals to try and get things done in the public interest, at least as a principle, you know, as a principle, okay? And so the idea is whatever politicians may say in public, that's theater. Most of that is theater, okay? Donald Trump saying that the election was stolen from him. It isn't that it's a lie, it's theater, okay? The Republicans embracing that, even though privately they will laugh at it and ridicule it, is theater, okay? We are relatively passive spectators at that theater because most of us don't know any better. And so when somebody comes along and says, hey, you know, the election was stolen from me, and this is the person you voted for, well, you got really kind of two choices. First, one is you call them out on it, but then you think, well, man, but I voted for this person. And the other one is you think, if I voted for someone who's a liar, I'm going to feel stupid. I think I'm going to ride this one out. And pretty soon, you will tell yourself that what they're saying is true. This happens a lot. Happens a lot, not just in the United States, but it certainly is happening a lot in the United States right now. Now, you know, if elections are an important mechanism of politics and of oversight, okay, if you devalue the legitimacy of an election, whether recklessly or deliberately, intentionally, you are weakening the republic. Now, if you seek to overthrow that republic and replace it with something else, we generally call that one of two things, either a coup or a revolution. Okay. In other words, we're going to tear down the existing system and we're going to replace it with something else. That's still politics. Okay. It's just politics at the barrel of a gun. But, you know, it's a radical extension of that notion of politics. Things have gotten so bad that we need to dismantle the existing system. One of the reasons why we have elections is to keep people from going to that extreme by saying, wait a minute, wait 2 more years and you'll have a chance to vote in this election. And, you know, it's a safety valve. It allows people to expel some of their frustration. And generally, to the extent that elections are perceived to have integrity, even people whose candidates lose generally will accept the outcome. It's really rare that Americans will say of a duly elected official, you know, that's not my president, or that's not my senator, or whatever. Generally, Americans have grown up generationally accepting the idea that the outcome of that public process is now something with which they have to live. Okay, it doesn't mean that we're passive. It's being pragmatic, because we understand there's only so much we can do. I can't, you know, if the White House advocates, you know, what to me seems like a stupid policy, there's not a lot I can do about that. Okay, they're not going to listen to me, and there's really no reason why they should, right? I don't have any money. I don't have any influence. No one cares what I say. Why should they listen to me? It's all about pragmatics. It's not, you know, it's not, that in itself is not corruption. That's inevitable in a republic of, you know, 325 million people, that's going to happen. So first of all, in terms of understanding why we study politics, okay, it's because it is what determines our public life. And whether we like it or not, what happens in our public life mitigates what we're able to do in our private life. And so if for no other reason, it's important that we study politics. But in addition to that, it is part of the obligation of adult life, that there is an expectation in a republic that you're going to take on some of that obligation of becoming informed, remaining current, helping to educate your children or your neighbors or your friends or whoever, right? So that generally there is an atmosphere of attentiveness and concern and a responsible engagement in public life, in the absence of which the government really will run over us. It really will. Now, understand, at no point did I say there that there's a need to pick up weapons and break things and shoot people. Normally there isn't. That's happened relatively rarely in the history of this country, but it has happened, okay? And that's, I would suggest to you, a lot of people would say that's when politics breaks down. That's when politics fails. What I'm suggesting you think about is it is still trying to influence a public outcome. You're still trying to influence a public outcome, right? We're going to go to the Capitol and we're going to demonstrate. And in the midst of that demonstration, we're going to frighten the legislature into delaying the certification of the election. Okay, that's borderline illegal. If you try deliberately to impede any institution of the American government from carrying about its legitimate business, that is by definition an insurrection. It is. You need to understand that. And by the way, it's not the same thing that happened. A lot of people compared this to the sort of young, you know, anti-war march on Washington and on the Pentagon back in 68, 69. What people forget is that those people, there were far more of them, okay? They carried out no deliberate acts of violence. There was no, you know, deliberate destruction of property, and there was no attempt of any kind to interrupt the normal business of government. In fact, other than trespass, which they did very little of, because most of that's, right, those are public spaces, okay? They did nothing illegal, okay? Now, there were plenty of times when anti-war demonstrators and other people did things that were functionally illegal, you know, civil disobedience and blatant rioting and violence, okay? But it wasn't the same thing, and they're not an accurate comparison, okay? It's like comparing Pearl Harbor to 9/11. They're not the same thing. Pearl Harbor was an attack by one military on an installation of another military. That's not what 9/11 was, okay? And there's no meaningful basis of comparison there, okay? So we need to be, but again, for me to be able to say that, for me to be able to explain that, I have to presume that you understand politics. You can't do that unless you study it. Politics is not something you just learn by observation. It is something that requires study, okay? And so again, what we're interested in studying is the process of determining public outcomes, of deciding who gets what, when, and how. That's what politics is. It's also why we study it, because it's an indispensable component of our private lives. Even if we don't want to be involved in politics, we are, because we're subject to those outcomes. The thing about a political outcome is that it's generalizable to the public. Okay, now I'm almost done for today, but do you have any questions so far? Okay.
What would be like an alternative definition of politics? Like, what would be like a Marxist definition of politics?
It would be the same.
Uh-huh.
It would still be the same. I mean, there's no reason for a Marxist to try to argue that the process, that the political process is not a determination of who gets what, when, and how. They would just say that the determination of how that's done is disproportionately dominated by a ruling class, a capitalist class. Bryce, do you have your hand up? Is that what that is?
Yes, sir.
What's your question or comment?
Well, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but I was wondering when you were talking about influence and how, the government not necessarily listening to every Joe on the street isn't entirely corruption. I was wondering, and I might be jumping ahead, how one could change that to where your voice would be able to be heard and listened to with gusto and not just, whatever, it's just a random opinion.
No, it's a perfectly.
But if I'm jumping ahead in
no, you're not.
Course, then that's okay.
It's the right question asked at the right time. Okay.
Okay.
It brings us to one of the most important developments and necessities of vibrant political life: collective action. Okay. There is a class that Sean Patterson teaches now called American Collective Action that I used to teach. I used non-American examples, but it was disproportionately American. Okay. And so the argument of that class is, the thesis of that class is directly a response, Bryce, to your question, which is, if you want to ensure that your grievances are being heard, or that your demands are at least being heard and are more likely to be responded to, you're more effective if you act collectively. There is strength in numbers, okay? But in addition to that, as we'll see when we go along, one of the really important sort of bedrock elements of politics everywhere is institutions, okay? Now, an institution is not the thing that houses things. In other words, like if you go to, when we get back on campus, right, you will be present in an institution, but it's not the buildings and it's not even the people, all right? It's the processes that determine the institution. That is, that institution, the university, was created originally to educate an affluent elite to prepare them for leadership, in public life, right? We now have broadened that out so that ostensibly, at least, it's to prepare anyone, let's face it, who has the price of admission to be better prepared to meet the challenges of adult life and thereby be able to participate in a more active and effective way. But one of the things that you learn in institutions like the university is there are all kinds of organizations, and it's those organizations that exercise disproportionate influence over what happens on that campus, okay? The larger society is the same thing. So in answer to Bryce's question, which is perfectly appropriate and timed well, I would suggest what we learn from studying politics is action is most effective when it is coordinated with others who share that desire. You might not share every single desire, but there's something you all believe in, even though you may believe in different other things. That you've decided that whatever else you do or don't believe in, or whether you're religious or agnostic or atheist, you oppose slavery. Or whatever else you believe in, whether you're religious, agnostic, or atheist, or Republican or Democrat or whatever, you oppose violence against women, or you oppose the victimization of LGBTQ Americans, and enough is enough, or whatever, or you're advocating for human rights, or for that matter, you're advocating against them. because you think that, these are special privileges that shouldn't exist. For whatever reason, you expressing that preference as an individual have essentially no voice. And there's an argument that could be made that you really shouldn't have. You have the right to speak, but you don't have the right to be followed. However, if that voice resonates because you've built an institution to amplify it, okay, now you can be heard. And the more you can be heard, the more people are likely to respond to you, because you're going to draw people to you in a popular movement, collective action. To the extent that you're effective, the government is compelled to listen to you, because if they don't, they face the same dilemma we talked about earlier. They're concerned, well, there's this group of people and they're upset. How do we know? Because we see them acting together. Okay. Sometimes it goes south. When you think about that 100 days of the summer in Portland, there were a lot of really principled people out there who didn't want to destroy property, didn't want to burn things, and didn't want to throw down with the cops, but they knew they needed to get out. They needed to be visible. They needed to be emphatic in their demands that, police violence must stop, and that particularly targeted violence against people of color and poor people must stop. Okay. There were other people who looked at that as an opportunity to get out and kick some ass, and that's going to happen. Politics isn't pretty, it's messy, okay? But that's the key to pursuing a public outcome. You have to involve the public. You have to demonstrate to the public that there's a reason why they should consider your point of view. And if your point of view is amplified by 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 or 1,000,000, suddenly it's not just your point of view. Suddenly it's a view that should be considered because it's achieved a critical mass of support. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it is the reason why we study politics, okay? Because we start to realize these public outcomes, the government doesn't always listen to us, but that is not de facto a sign of corruption, okay? It just means, there are 300 odd million of us, and we all open our mouths and we all want things, and a lot of times we want things we shouldn't have. I mean, there is a capacity in this country, more than any other country I've ever been in, to maintain a kind of terminal adolescence or post-adolescence where, irrespective of what our chronological age is, many of us still behave like adolescents, where it's just like, I don't care. This is what I want, and it's like, when you're a parent having raised two sons who are now out of adolescence, you don't want to throw down with your kids, but sometimes you got to remind them that there's a power structure in place, and that power structure is what's keeping them from starving in the street. And that's a crummy thing to have to do, but it is a response to that really self-involved, self-important notion that we all have somewhere between the ages of 13 and 20, where we haven't yet fully emerged as adults and had a few punches and a few scars put on us by adult life, and we still think we can make demands like we did when we were 3. Okay, we got a lot of people in this country who are 40 and 50 and 60 who still behave that way. Okay. And to the extent that they can mobilize and organize, they're going to be listened to. So if you're wondering what's going on with the Republican Party, for example, okay, part of what's going on is that, you have areas of the country, small towns, rural America, sort of what used to be called blue collar America, now in the so-called Rust Belt and places like that, where there have been these seismic shifts in the political economy of those areas. Industry has fled, we've deindustrialized in those areas. And suddenly people who used to be able to make enough of an income to think about sending their daughters and sons to college are struggling just to survive on 2 jobs. They're being left behind. They're being ignored, okay? And so they're angry and they're frightened, okay? Now, it doesn't justify acting a fool any more than it does when you're 3, but it explains it. And so a lot of studying politics, one of the hardest things for people to do when they're studying politics is to stop judging and start trying to figure out why something's happening. And trying to explain something is not excusing it. It's trying to explain it. Trying to understand it doesn't mean it's okay. Americans do a lot of incredibly irresponsible things because we're human beings and we're fallible. But what's more interesting to me is why we do that. And a lot of times it's because we haven't yet been able to solve the dilemma that Bryce posed for us, which is, how do I get heard? Well, I yell really loud. And in fact, you know what? I shoot a gun or I punch a cop or something like that. You know, the problem with that is, yeah, it's going to get you in the news, although not for very long because the news cycle is, you know, insatiable. But it's not necessarily going to change anything because the cops have been shooting people for a century and a half. And we've been shooting each other and beating each other to death for a century and a half and more. Okay. There's nothing new about that. It's not news. We're violent. Okay. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity for violence. But what a lot of the philosophers and thinkers we're going to look at who focus on politics are telling us is there are a lot of other ways to do politics besides threatening people's existence and threatening their lives. There are a lot of really effective things to think about, okay? Aristotle, for example, cannot be understood as a political philosopher until we accept his notion that we are by nature political, that we're social animals. We're not isolated individuals. That's hard for Americans because just cradle to grave, we're pretty much get this relentless message that we matter as individuals and that sort of swamps any kind of public outcome. And this is why we argue over things like whether or not to get vaccinated or whether or not to wear a mask. I mean, you know, why would you get angry with someone who in the midst of a pandemic is wearing a mask? Why is that grounds to punch it? Well, it isn't, but we see it happen again and again. Why? Because it's a manifestation of people's fear, their ignorance, and their frustration. People don't understand what COVID is. People don't understand what a pandemic is. People believe it's a conspiracy, whatever it is, okay? If you don't have an understanding of what's going on around you, you're much more prone to do really dangerous, stupid things. Even though you might not be a dangerous, stupid person, you might be able to be persuaded that it's time for you to get nasty, okay? And so the idea is the more we understand about the institutions and processes of achieving these public outcomes, the nature of collective action, both within the state and outside of it, the more we understand that politics is much more than just the leadership of Democratic and Republican parties arguing, and the myth that we're all so hopelessly polarized that we can't agree on anything, which, by the way, is a myth, not borne out by any available data, you know, but it's a popular narrative. And we're going to accept it because there's no countervailing narrative to explain what's going on in the country. And so we accept, well, what's going on is that we're polarized. And so people get angry or they get frightened, okay? Well, you know, most of us aren't polarized. How can we have a country where most Americans, most of the time, know nothing about politics and aren't terribly interested, and at the same instant say we're as polarized as we've been since we fought the Civil War? That makes no logical sense. And yet that's the prevailing narrative on Fox and MSNBC and CNN and, you know, all the so-called authority institutions. The fact is they know relatively little, and they're not in the, you know, they have no interest in telling the truth. They're not lying deliberately. They don't have to. They're trying to create an interesting narrative because those are commercial enterprises and they need continually to demonstrate their relevance. One way to do that, explain things through a compelling narrative. Well, there's no more compelling narrative, no more compelling human narrative than us against them. Nothing is more compelling to a human being than that. You know, that which side are you on? That isn't all of what politics is. It is what politics is compressed into when you live in a kind of media culture like ours. And so part of the utility of this class is let's break through those images and myths and false narratives and try and figure out what's really going on. Now, here's the most important thing before I let you go. You have to decide what you're going to do with it, okay? I'm not at all interested in achieving an outcome here in terms of what you think. I just want you to think. But the conclusions you draw are your own, okay? You don't have to agree with me to do well in this class. You just have to make sense. Okay, that's really important that you understand that I'm not looking. Now, you know, there are people who teach this kind of class as though they had some revealed wisdom that they were passing on to you and that you could just forget everything else, listen to them, and you'd know the truth. Okay. I've had professors like that. Okay. I'm not one of those people. I got my failings. We all have, but that ain't one of them. Okay. I'm not looking for little robots and clones. I don't mind if we exchange, as long as it's personal. I don't mind an exchange of ideas, because one of the things is none of you knows what my personal politics are. You know why? Because it's none of your business. And your personal politics are none of my business. We're studying here. We're not advocating, right? I'm not trying to change your minds. You can't change my mind because I'm old and stupid, right? So don't waste your time. But let's spend that time and devote that energy to just trying to figure out what the hell we think is going on. But understand that we're going to disagree in here. That's okay. You know, welcome to a representative empowered republic. You know, disagreement's a good thing, but have that disagreement informed by something, not just because someone told you to think that way. That's authoritarianism, okay? And if there are a few things that I'm actually anti about, that's one of them. I don't like the herd mentality. That's the downside of human beings, because it's the easy way out of everything. You just roll along with the herd. How many of you have ever been actually involved in a riot, where you've actually been in the middle of it? Okay, that's where you realize what human beings are capable of. Because, you know, you can see it. It's almost like a train wreck. One instant, the train's just rolling down the tracks and everything's cool and you're kind of dozing. Next thing you know, everything's in chaos. And that's a riot. Okay. What that's not ultimately is effective. Okay. It's just spilled energy, and it's usually wasted because it gives the coercive authorities a blank check to come in and crack your skulls. Okay. And you are not going to outgun the police. You're just not. And you're not going to outgun the military. And ultimately, if we're sensible about it, we don't really want you to, because that means you could take control of our entire republic just because you got more bullets and guns than us. When we were talking about earlier about this idea, and Jackson brought it up first, about a principle as being, a bedrock principle. One of the bedrock principles of this republic, okay, is that violence is not the prescription for anything. Okay, that's an assumption of politics, that if you have to resort to violence, the system is broken and it's time to get rid of it. Okay, there is no constitutional right to overthrow the government. Not in this country, not in any country. It doesn't exist, and it never has. The reason for that is, if it did exist, we would have no security under law, because in the same breath, you would be saying there's no reason to respect the rule of law. Because every time you wanted to break the law, you could simply say, I'm overthrowing a tyrannical government. I murdered my neighbor, not because he kept borrowing my lawnmower and I don't like his face, but because I'm overthrowing a tyrannical government, imposing its tyranny on me by telling me I can't kill my neighbor. My neighbor's dead. What are you going to do about it? We can't live like that. You can't. You can't sustain a society living like that. And so the notion of politics is, all right, how do we resolve this tension short of you murdering your neighbors? Well, we have a public outcome. That public outcome, we make a law that says, wait a minute, you give up that right. You don't have that right. If you're going to live in this republic, you don't have the right to murder your neighbor. You don't. Now, do you have any right to defend yourself? Well, the problem with that is, of course, it depends on what state you're living in. Okay, but it's limited. It still exists, but it's limited. That's what government is. To govern something or someone is to contain them within boundaries. That's what government is. You govern your children when you raise them. Okay, you govern the land when you domesticate agriculture. You govern people when you create a society under law. There's nothing inherently tyrannical about that. Human beings have shown over millennia that we cannot be trusted just to follow our own impulses without being destructive. And so we've chosen governments. They haven't been imposed on us. We've chosen them. Ultimately, historically, okay? Now, are there any questions about that? Do you kind of see where we're going? I mean, ultimately, I'd like this to be less me foaming on and more discussion, but I understand we're just getting started. You haven't had a chance to look at the notes or think much about things specific to the class, but ultimately think of it that way. The less I talk, the better the class is going.
I think the kind of thing that you just said about governments not being imposed on us, could you kind of expand on that? I mean, that's kind of your interpretation from reading history? You feel like it?
What I mean by that, Jackson, is a fair question. Let me say what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that no one imposed this government on the people who lived here. I'm not saying that laws have not been imposed on people in this or other countries. What I'm saying is the institutional structure that we call government is something people chose. Otherwise, it never could have existed. Okay, there's always been an authority structure. In every society of which we have any record, however imperfect, there has been an authority structure. An authority structure is government. You can't have that imposed on you all the time. People have to be willing to concede to it. One of the reasons why we do concede to be governed is because most of us don't want to lead. We don't want to. I don't want to lead. I mean, can you imagine me leading a society? I mean, most of you don't know me that well, but come on. Did you get any indication at all? Yeah, I trust my fate to that guy. No, of course not. I don't make the height requirement. I'm too ugly, and I'm too volatile. Those are I'm 3 strikes, I'm out. I don't deserve to rule. Okay, but what I can do behind the scenes, I can make sense of it. Okay, but if I'm being misunderstood, Jackson, it's because I misspoke. I don't want to be misinterpreted as understanding that no one's ever had government imposed on them. That's what colonialism is. That's what slavery is. I mean, so if that's what you were concerned about, no, I'm not denying that, of course. But what I'm saying is the choice to create institutions of governance, to create governments, is one that human beings created. In other words, there was no other species that domesticated us. Wolves did not choose to be domesticated into dogs. We did. Okay, because we knew that we couldn't survive. Now, the differences historically have to do with, well, what was the process? How did we go from what some philosophers refer to as a state of nature, when we were just sort of rolling around out there, small communities of hunter-gatherers and very short lifespan and nasty, Bruce and short and all that. How did we go from that to where we are right now? At what point did human beings consent to be governed? And that's where philosophers differ. Okay. And their differences matter because all their differences are premised on some assumption about what human nature is. In other words, human beings chose government because. Philosophers differ on that, okay? But what I'm suggesting is just that, for people who say they are anti-government, you're talking about a kind of living that we have no evidence that this species ever undertook, ever. From the point where we could communicate and reason with one another, we developed power structures. Those original power structures were largely physical. Okay. But that's still a power structure. And, you can say, well, the stronger people imposed it on the weaker. There are always more, in terms of numbers, there are always more weak people than there are strong. And anybody can kill anybody. Weak people kill strong people every day. You just look at the murder rate. You got weak people killing strong people every day. It also depends on what you call weak and strong. If, I'm not physically strong, I can persuade people to do things, though. I'm real cagey about that. Otherwise, I never would have survived. I know how to convince people not to hurt me. And more importantly, I know how to convince people to help me. It's not infallible, but that's a survival mechanism. Now, I'm not physically stronger than most people, but I'd argue ultimately I'm stronger than they are. If I can get someone to do what I want them to do, I don't care. I'm stronger. I'm getting what I want, and they're not hurting me. I win. Scoreboard. Okay, that's what I mean by government. It isn't all government by force. I mean, there are very few people in the House and Senate right now whose ass I couldn't kick physically, mano a mano. That's not why they're governing me, because they can beat me up. Okay, but I still have to concede to their authority. And part of me is willing to do that because if I perceive that they are there legitimately, that they belong there, that we've set up institutions that they have to go through to demonstrate that they now have the authority to govern, and they pass that test, I have to accept that. I can disagree with it, but I have to accept it. And if they pass a law, I'm just as much bound by it as anybody else. So they're stronger than me. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Now, let me just, one more thing to clarify. I'm sorry if I interrupted. When I make a statement like that, I'm not trying to convince you that it's true. Okay. I'm saying to you, full disclosure, this is my understanding of things. But if Jackson, you're thinking, you know what, I don't see it that way. Okay, you're going to have the opportunity to explain that, which you may want to do right now, or you may want to do later in the class. But you see what I'm saying? In other words, I'm not, Jackson, trying to change your mind. Okay, but it's kind of hard to look at the history of the species and not acknowledge, we kind of kept choosing people to help make our decisions for us. And maybe there was a certain democratic, we talk about pirates, right? And one of the odd things about pirates is how incredibly democratic they tended to be. It was not uniform, but not at all uncommon for people who were in pirate vessels in the Caribbean, for example, to have places where they would go after they plundered everyone and then equally divide things up. If they were going to make a decision as to where they would go next or what they were going to do, it would often be put to a vote of the crew. I mean, they were certainly more democratic than, say, the British Royal Navy that was trying to track them down and kill them. Okay, so it's not like one were the bad guys and one were the good guys, and the more democratic people are the good guys. There's a lot wrong with democracy too. There's a lot wrong with trusting ignorant, impulsive people to make meaningful decisions. And then you start to consider the alternatives. And you start to think, well, maybe we're stuck with that. All right, so what I'd like you to do then is look over those notes for module 1. And then to the extent that you see anything there that doesn't make sense, you have a couple of options. One, you can let me know, and you can meet with me at my regularly scheduled noon to 1 office hour on Zoom, or you can write those questions down. And when we begin the class next Tuesday, you can ask me those questions and we can start there. Because I want to make sure that if any of the stuff, either anything that I'm saying or anything that I'm writing or anything anyone else is writing, if it doesn't make sense, that's where we have to start. Okay, but you have to trust that because you don't know the answer to something or you don't understand something, that it's not a stupid question. It's that cliche thing, but it's true. The stupid questions are the ones you don't ask. Okay, there's just not going to be very many stupid questions. And I want you to feel comfortable about, particularly in class, because then the benefit of that discussion is everyone's, to be able to say, well, wait a minute, it's kind of like Jackson said, wait a minute, are you saying no one's ever had government imposed on them? No, you compelled me to do what I should have done. You helped me clarify myself. That made that discussion better, because Jackson's reminding me, okay, you know what, you're right, man. I said something, it's clear in my head. I'm trying to finish up so I can get you out of here. Let me clarify that, okay? And that's a good call. Or like asking about, well, if what you said about people's voices being ignored is the case, then what do we do about that? That's a perfectly legitimate question. And it followed logically from what we had been talking about. And obviously there was a response to that. Yeah, think about collective action. So that's the way I'd like the class to go. That, over time, there will be less of me foaming along and more of you saying, well, wait a minute, when I was reading those notes from Aristotle, he was saying this and this and this, but doesn't that mean this and this and this? See, it's not that that's work I don't have to do. It actually makes the class harder for me because I got to be ready to answer just about any kind of question. That's cool. I like doing that. But also it gives you a chance to be involved. And where better to be involved than in a class that studies politics, right? I mean, how involved do you really have to be in a basic biology class? It's not the same. It's every bit as important, but you're not going to argue about cell structure. Okay, you're going to learn it. This is different. We can kind of argue about this stuff. And I've intentionally, as you'll see when you look through the syllabus, I've included a lot of conflicting points of view. That's intentional. It helps us to kind of strike sparks without anybody getting hurt. All right, anything else? Yes, Ariana.
For the assignment that's due on October 6th, like the 2 paragraphs that we're supposed to write, how would you like the setup to be? Would you like that in MLA formatting, APA, or just like standard 2 paragraphs, like not specific?
Well, I would say standard 2 paragraphs, except that I want you always in your writing for this in every class to be very careful that if you make any statement that relies on something other than your own original thinking, you find a way to cite it. Because I need to know when I'm reading, okay, among other things, not only do you avoid plagiarism, but it lets me know, okay, which of the things I'm providing for them are they finding most useful? And I'll know because it'll show up in your work. Well, if you're citing the notes, for example, and you don't have to worry too much about that because it's our first written assignment. If there's something in, like maybe you cite one of the videos or something like that, then I'll think, okay, that's good. I'm going to leave that video up there because it seems to be effective and students seem to be benefiting from it because they're citing it. But also it helps you avoid plagiarism. Because plagiarism is an F.
Sorry. So if we say something like we study like a statement that's just as simple as we study politics because it can't be understood just by observation, it must be studied, like just a basic statement like that in our writing, would you want us to like back that up somehow with like a citation? Okay.
Well,
But
you know what
if
I'd
we
rather
heard
have-
that from the Zoom, then how would we cite that?
Okay. What I'd rather have you do there, rather than try to cite a source, what I'd rather have you do is explain to me what you mean. Okay, because if you'll notice, the way that I'll normally do things myself, and I find that this works, is I'll make a statement, we chose government, okay, and then try and explain by that what I mean is this. Now, in the case of that, it required Jackson to kind of prompt me, hey, can you finish that thought? You're trying to bring us in for a landing a little prematurely here. That's a pretty provocative statement. It is, and I owed you more explanation than that. You'll find that I do that more when I'm looking at the clock and thinking, man, they're getting tired. I got to get them out of here. But when you make that kind of statement, try and explain to me why you make that statement and why you believe it to be true. If you don't believe something to be true, right, don't write it. Okay, just because I wrote it doesn't mean you have to accept it as true. If your mind is just not settled on that, or you might say, the instructor claims this to be the case. On the other hand, if we follow that to a logical extension, it would mean this, which I find not to be plausible. I'm not going to get mad. I'm going to be ecstatically happy, right? But if you're using another source to create your argument, then I want you to cite that. Don't worry about citing me. Okay, as I say, I'd like to know if you got an idea from the videos that are posted or things like that, because then I know that you're finding them useful. What I'm more concerned about is that when we get into specific thinkers and their work, if you're going to say something about Aristotle, you need to show me where you got that, because I'm going to assume that most of you know nothing about most of the people we're studying. That's not an indictment, by the way. That's just a fact on the ground. Most of us just don't read this stuff unless, like me, you get paid to do it. Or like me, you're stupid.
Or if you went to St. John's.
Or I was going to say, or you just were lucky enough to have an education that required that you dig a little deeper. Okay. And so am I answering your question, Ariana? I hope.
Yeah, you did. So if we use like a citation from like a research article, like a scholarly article or something, would you prefer that citation in APA or MLA formatting?
What are you most comfortable with?
Probably MLA.
Then use it.
Okay, thank
The
you.
advantage of where I am is I read stuff from a lot of disciplines, and they don't all use the same formatting in their articles. And so I'm going to understand, if you put like author date, page number, or author date or whatever, I'm going to know what you're talking about. You can use footnotes, you can use endnotes, you can use, embedded citations, you can use whatever's comfortable for you. But I also want you to acquire the habit of writing in a very complete form, even when you're writing short essays. That is, I don't want you, it's very important. I don't want you to use vernacular. I don't want you to use cliches. I don't want you to use slang. I don't want you to write for me like you're talking to your buddy. I want you to write like you want to be taken seriously. And what you're doing is you're trying to explain something to me. And you're not going to do that by using cliches and slang. It's not going to work because there's too much vagary there. Does that make sense? Okay. I mean, even when I'm speaking extemporaneously, I really try to avoid using any kind of sort of common tongue. You know, I try to speak as formally as I can without being so stuffy that you can't understand me, because it's important to me that I make as clear as possible what I'm thinking. I want you to approach your assignments in the same way. I want your best writing. Okay. Okay. Last thing I'm going to say about the assignment then is, on the first assignment, I'm going to look at those, and then some of you, I'm going to say, yeah, this is fine. Some of you, I'm going to say, I want to give you the opportunity to rewrite this. Will you meet with me in my office hour or otherwise, so that we can talk about ways that you can make this better? I want to try and catch the less effective writing early in the term, because I found that if I do that early in the term and give you the opportunity to rewrite, students tend to respond very positively to that, and their writing improves and their confidence in their writing improves. Does that make sense? Okay, so I do allow people an opportunity to rewrite their work, but I don't want your first draft. I want a finished draft of everything you write. That's why these assignments are short. It's like, you've got time. Sketch out a draft of it, let it sit for a couple days. That's why I'm not requiring this assignment on Sunday. You know, maybe sketch out a response over the weekend. Then we've got one more class meeting on Monday, which is a chance for you to ask more questions. Then you can go back and refine that draft, and you've kicked its ass in slang terms, right? And it's very effective, and you're going to do better in the class, but really more importantly, you're going to learn more. Okay. And that's what I want you to do. It's not just, look, I can make words on the page. It's like, in the process of explaining this on the page, I find I actually understand it better. Okay.
So this class is on Mondays as well?
No, did I say Monday?
It's fine. Just next Tuesday then.
Next
Okay.
Tuesday. I teach on Monday. My class sessions are Monday and Tuesday, and then during the rest of the week, I schedule office hours.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never tried the hybrid thing. So if I say Monday, I mean, and also normally I teach 201 on Monday and Wednesday. So it's stuck in my head that if it's 201, this must be Monday or this must be Wednesday. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. And so you typically will never go till 3:20, or?
I don't know why I would.
It's just listed from 1:30 to 3:20, the class.
In other words, we have as much time as we need, but you know, I mean, we run out of gas after a while. You're sitting there and you're stuck. And by the way, you know, if you need to get up, a couple of you've done this, but if you need to get up and move around and you want to kill your camera for you to get up and stretch, go ahead and do it. I would if I could, but if my camera goes blank, you're going to be like, he's not really here. This is totally recorded. He's drinking a beer somewhere. I'm not. I'm right here, right? But if you want to get up and move around when we get back into class, if you can do it sort of discreetly, to go in the back of class, just stand up a little bit. I mean, we had a meeting this morning. I stood up through the whole meeting because I had been sitting in front of this camera since 6 o'clock in the morning because I was talking to the East Coast, and I just didn't want to sit anymore. So I understand that if you're sitting for a long time, you can just, you know, you can just kind of, I'm so close to the ground, why don't I just lay down? If you want to get up and move around, you know, you can. All I'm asking you to do is try and do it without being disruptive. Okay. But I'd rather have you go to the back, move around, recharge a little bit, and then get more out of the class. Okay. And yeah, bear with me because I'm going to say Monday and Wednesday more often than I should with this class. You know, I'll get out of the habit. I don't remember the last time I taught this Tuesday and Thursday. Anyway, anything else? So take a look at the notes. Take a look at the prompt. It's just a sentence, you know, maybe draft out a possible response before next Tuesday. Okay, so that we have a chance to sit down and talk about it. If you know, I mean, this work can be to some extent collaborative. I don't care. I just want you to learn. I don't care how you get there. It's not cheating if you discuss your work with people. Okay. All right. Other than that, I'm available online at a minimum every day from noon to 1, every weekday. But I'm generally available at other times during the day, as long as I don't have something else scheduled. So if you suddenly, coming up on an assignment, and you're thinking you understood it, and you start to produce the assignment, and you're thinking, I'm completely lost, rather than panic, just shoot me an email and let's see how quickly we can meet. Okay. And we'll make sure that, you're at least feeling a little more confident before you submit an assignment. Okay. I don't have a problem with that at all. Other than that, I will see you next week. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh,
Thank you.
When will the recording be available?
In about 20 minutes.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you.